Good afternoon and welcome to NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Morten Bøås. I'm a research professor here at NUPI. And welcome to this seminar on tax and state-society relations. Is there such a thing as a fiscal contract? And this is a seminar that is organized by the so-called Tax Cap Dev Network, which and the main partners is NUPI, CMI, and Tax Justice Network Norway. And we want to, we have several seminars. Some of them are more sort of policy-oriented, but this is also very much an academic network and a research-based network. And every now and then we like to take a step back and sort of ask some of the more fundamental questions. Questions that are fundamental to tax and tax authority and tax legitimacy, but also questions that are in many ways fundamental to how we understand state-society relations and how we understand this thing called the state that we take for granted, but sometimes it's not too easy to understand what it actually is, how it operates, and how its operability also depends on various different contexts and circumstances, be that contemporary or historically. So in this seminar we ask, the standard way of thinking about this is that see sort of the relationship between citizens and the state as some sort of a fiscal contract, where citizens pay taxes based on getting something in return. And this something is, it could be simply protection, it could be security, but most often one think of this as the state then provides certain public goods to people, infrastructure, health, education, and so on and so forth. In some cases this works quite okay, in other cases it works not so okay, and in some cases it doesn't work at all. But still, states exist, societies exist, and there are relationships between them. And we have noticed in some of the work that we do, both in the network, but also in other research projects that is being carried out and implemented at NUPI, but also in CMI, but also elsewhere in the world, that we also are talking about the regimes who may look not very nice seen from our perspective, but which seems to have quite considerable public support. So can we then talk about a fiscal contract between states and citizens, or is it something else that determines this? Could other factors beyond fiscal exchange play a more important role in shaping what we may call social contracts in certain societies? We want to ask what kind of limitations do the fiscal contract model have? And what implications do these have for development policies in different contexts? So in this seminar, we will explore these questions and try to challenge some of the conventional understandings and wisdoms of the financial contract. And it's also interesting to see that whereas tax research used to be sort of the domain of a very sort of select, and I would say quite small group of economists, it has become much broader these days. Also, not only people who just work on tax, but also economists who work more on sort of larger social economic issues have started to be interested in this and provided a lot of good analysis. But also political science and increasingly also anthropologists have started to look at tax as something that is seen as a part of the social structure of societies. So these are some of the things that also this network would like to take forward also next year, when we are going to have a larger event in Oslo, either in May or in August. So you could also see this, we also see this as a little appetizer of things to come from this network. Anyway, we are going to run this today, and I will remind people that we do stream this event. So that means that when we get to the Q&A, there will be a microphone circulating. Otherwise, those that either are listening in directly or we're listening in later. I mean, they don't have a chance to hear what you're saying if you don't use the microphone. And we'll do this as some sort of a combination of some short presentation and then sort of a panel discussion thereafter, where I'll try to sort of, well, how should I say, act as this kind of host of a TV show or whatever to try to see if we can illuminate the discussion. But before we start, let me introduce the three panelists. I mean, the first to go is Markus Löwe of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability based in Bonn. Markus is a senior researcher at the German Institute, and he has worked extensively in North Africa and the Middle East and contributed some very important work on what we may call the evolution of new social contracts in the MENA region. I just want to at least point people to a very important article that was published in World Development in 2021, and a very recent special issue that Markus has been responsible for, that came out, in fact, this year, I think, in Mediterranean politics, about changes in social contracts in the MENA region. We also have Maria Nurkunate, which is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science in Vilnius University. Maria has a PhD in area studies from the University of Oxford, and in her PhD study she looked at the Russian-speaking communities in the 3 Baltic states and their claim towards the state in terms of social contract. Very interesting work that Maria did in her PhD, and we're looking forward now to see the articles that comes out of this, but also your new postdoctoral work at the Vilnius University. We'd also like to mention that Maria is a very active member of the Anthropology of Tax Network. And finally, we will have our own NUPI's own Viljar Håvik, who is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Oslo, where he's looking at tax authority and how people sort of respond to being taxed, and new forms of taxation in the case of Mali and Liberia. Viljar has already published some important work from his studies in Mali, and I'm looking forward, also as the supervisor, to see the forthcoming articles, particularly about this attempt at property tax reform in Liberia, and what this means both for the Liberian state, which used to be sort of this kind of Jupiter state, I mean, like really an imperial presidency. And this is really the first attempt, if it really happens, to also reform this state, but also how people in the context of Liberia actually thinks about it. Do they actually believe that they will now be left with 50% of their property tax being paid at the local level? What we have seen so far is to say it's a good idea. But anyway, I mean, thanks for being here today, and we'll start by Markus. So please, Markus.
Morten, thank you very much for inviting me to NUPI, to Oslo. I jump immediately into the topic. So as you have also already mentioned, our starting point is the social contract. So the very beginning was not really focused on taxes. And I mean, given that all what I present here is work done with 4 or 5 other colleagues at IDOS in Bonn. So we were looking at stability in countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And we were asking ourselves what makes stability or instability in that region. So we use the term social contract. Yeah, you all know this word has been coined by liberal philosophers, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and so on. So we argue that today, in a way, all countries tend to have a social contract. Yeah? Perhaps Somalia or Yemen might be an exception, but more or less all have it, while the liberal philosophers were still concerned about having a social contract at all. We define social contracts as a set of explicit and implicit agreements on the various groups of society with each other and with the government. So defining rights and obligations towards each other. So it's very important that a social contract has these two dimensions, and in different settings, the two dimensions can have different importance. Yeah? If after a conflict, a new social contract comes into being, of course, first we need these horizontal relations. The different groups who have been fighting against each other first have to agree that there will be a new state order again. Yeah? They have to agree that there will be a central government again. By time I have I favor one group and I give a lot to this group because this is important for my own staying power. Yeah? And social contracts prevail as long as the contracting parties adhere to them. Yeah? They can be adjusted, replaced by new ones, or overthrown. Yeah? And we have discussed this in this very recent special issue. Now, if we look at what is it that states and society give to each other, we argue that basically what the state can give can be put into three big pillars. The first is protection, that is collective and individual security, including rule of law, protection against foreign enemies, but also protection against terrorism, criminality, but also the state itself. Provision would be all kinds of social and economic services, education, health, but also competition in markets and so on. And finally, participation. And what can society give? Now, first of all, society is supposed to at least accept the rule of the government. It doesn't have to like it, yeah? But it has to accept it. So the alternative is to rebel against it, or members of society leaving the country. Yeah? So I refer here to Hirschman, exit, voice, and adherence to the system. Yeah? And in addition to this, and here come the taxes in, society is supposed to pay taxes, but also give other obligations. This can be military service, but this is also the acceptance of public goods, contribution to public goods. Yeah, we could talk a lot what this all includes. I think we don't have the time for the moment. And what is also very important is the stability of social contracts depends a lot on the ideological framing of it. The story that this country builds around the social contract. In Arab countries, in many, it was the government has freed countries from colonial power, and now the government is legitimate to rule the country. In other contexts, the story may be different. Huh? But this narrative has some power. Unfortunately, we have not really yet found anything to really grasp it, to really operationalize it. But it is there. We should not forget about it. In 2020, we have run representative surveys in 3 Middle East and North African countries, Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we had to do it by telephone. Yeah? We all know telephone interviews, telephone surveys are much less reliable than face-to-face ones. But what we found out is, so one of the many questions that we asked is, would you agree with the following statements? Citizens should be loyal if the government provides for now security or social and economic services, or if the government has been elected in a fair and transparent manner. So that is the 3 Ps again. Should citizens be loyal if the government provides these 3 Ps? And as you can see, on average, in all 3 countries, a large majority said, yes, we agree with these statements. And we also asked if citizens should be loyal, if the government, if citizens should pay taxes. But we also asked, would you be ready to pay more taxes if the government provided more protection, more provision, and more participation? And again, a large number of people in all 3 countries said yes. Here you see already, in terms of participation, the percentage is a bit lower. Yeah? And this becomes even more apparent when we ask people to prioritize what are the number 1 or 2 duties of the government. So we had operationalizations for each of the 3 Ps. Yeah? So out of these 6, they had to select just 2. And you see people mainly chose provision. That's their first priority. Then comes protection, and definitely participation last. Now, I mean, we should not forget these three countries. They do provide, the state provides a decent degree of protection. Had we asked this question in the context of Syria or Libya, I am sure numbers would have been much higher here. Yeah? So they take this as for granted. Yeah? They struggle a bit with provision, but definitely participation comes last. So they all agree all three are important, but there is some kind of a hierarchy in needs. Yeah? A bit, perhaps we can think about Maslow and so on. It's not completely similar, but perhaps it goes a bit this way. So definitely there is a preference for all three, but there is also a preference for first protection, probably, then provision, then participation. I think I skipped this slide. Also this one. Last step that I would like to present here is we have tried to operationalize the three Ps. So we have searched for indicators for all three of them. So we have chosen a number of indicators for external threats, civil wars, criminal acts, state terror, rule of law, for protection, water and infrastructure, education, health, social protection, poverty reduction, employment, and economic rule of law and competition on markets for provision, and indicators for participation. We have tried to choose input indicators. Very often we are more interested in outcomes. Here we are interested in inputs because that is what the state gives. Yeah? We have constructed an index for each of the three Ps. And so far we have only published the results for 2019 for countries worldwide. And here you see them in the 3D room. We could also call it the 3P room. Yeah? So, and you see the dots, they are going basically up from somewhere here. Yeah? Here is the Yemens and Somalias and so on. And up there is the Norways. Yeah? With high values for all P. So basically what we can see here is apparently when states become stronger, they are better able to provide all three Ps. Yeah? But in the middle, we have a large range. Yeah? So we have not perfect variance between the three Ps. So apparently here we have different kinds of social contracts. Yeah? We have contracts that emphasize mainly protection. We have the ones that emphasize mainly provision, and others that emphasize mainly participation. And also what you can see there is apparently a bit of a regional clustering. That is, of course, the topic that we were interested in the Middle East and North Africa. Countries are low here. That means participation is low. Oh, still 2 minutes left. Okay. This is in other dimensions. So what I can do with this, I think then I will go back to this one. Also from our survey, we were interested, who is it who is dissatisfied with the existing social contracts? Who goes to the streets to voice dissatisfaction with the social contracts? Is it the ones who have reason to be dissatisfied? The poor, the less educated, the females, the ones without working contract? Or is it the ones who can afford to go to the streets, yeah? Which would be the rich, the educated, the males, the ones with a working contract? And the results are clear. It's the privileged. Yeah? It's the people from the top income quartile. It's the ones with tertiary education. Sorry, the green is here not very clear. The one who have a working contract. And negatively, here you have females. Females protest less. So in a way, it's a picture that shows us Going to the street doesn't show who is dissatisfied or who has reason to be dissatisfied. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to go to the streets. We have this for Lebanon and Tunisia only because in the end we distrust a little bit the results that we have for Egypt. Thank you.
I think that if we had been able to do a similar exercise when it comes to the tax riots that we saw in Nairobi during the summer, you would have seen some of the same things, that it's not the poorest who were trying to storm the parliament in Nairobi, but it was students from the middle class and upwards. But now we turn to a slightly different part of the world, the Baltic countries. Please, Maria.
So thank you so much for having me here. I will not have the slides, sadly. So give me a second. Yes, so in my presentation today, I will focus on the relationship between taxation and citizenship, which is something that I work on, but also briefly discussing how the question of the fiscal contract is approached by the anthropologists, many of whom are members of the network, mentioned kind of studying taxation and also social contract more generally, so how they kind of approach the question that we're asking today. So without further ado, taxes are often considered the primary way in which people enter the relationship with the state and other members of the community. And indeed, taxation is believed to be crucial in bringing about or delineating a collective on the national level. So through relations of generalized reciprocity that taxes could be thought of as, taxation is argued to bring into being an imagined community or publics, usually in the form of a national body. So it is not just the basis of the modern state, as the argument goes, but kind of also one of the core foundations of the political community itself. And as such, paying taxes is inextricably linked with the status of citizenship. Janet Reutemann argues that the payment of taxes constitutes, or at least historically has constituted, the founding economic transfer, and speaks of economic citizenship as a relational category between the state and society. Another prevalent idea in political economy as well is that taxation produces not just a citizen, but a particular type of a citizen, an engaged, active, and responsible one. Thus, in the Euro-Atlantic tradition, and I think this is where the emphasis is today, right? Taxes emerge as the basis for political representation and accountability, the source of citizens' voice and governmental legitimacy. And as a result, in popular policy and scholarly imaginations, taxation is often perceived as, and this is a quote, an actually existing social contract, as the social contract. And of course, many anthropologists working on taxation have shown that this is not always or even usually the case. That fiscal essentialism is limiting our gaze to less formal but no less important payments and contributions constituting our societies. The taxes have historically been used for oppression and exclusion rather than for political accountability, especially in colonial settings, and that it is therefore important to decenter taxation from the state and state-citizen nexus. Still more, Nicolette Mokovic and Robin Smith, in their special issue on taxes and the social contract that came out a few years ago, have shown how the latter is only one potential source of moral, social, and cosmic orders among many. So in other words, there are other ways societies can organize themselves, in addition to contractarian models. And yet the idea of the fiscal contract as the basis for the state-society relationship prevails. And here I find Gwen Burniet and Miranda Schill-Johansson's work a productive way to deal with this conundrum. So is there such a thing as a fiscal contract, or to push things even further, is there such a thing as a social contract? And the social contract is rarely a formalized agreement, even if we speak about it as tacit, implicit, and so on and so forth. and contractarian expectations seldomly hold in the real world. And maybe that is why we so often speak about broken social contracts or the need for a new, fairer, better, more just social contract. Thus, the authors argue that instead of thinking about this as this actually existing thing, it is better to conceptualize the social contract as a powerful idea. An idea that is rooted in very specific social theory associated with Western liberal thinkers of the Enlightenment, although I do acknowledge that other regions have their own contractarian traditions as well, that influences how people, governments, and academics, right, we as well, think about and experience state-society relations. Furthermore, because contractarian expectations rarely hold, the idea of the state-society relationship that is built on fair, equal, reciprocal agreement between the government and the people can emerge as a normative ideal, right? And even serve as a powerful critique to a situation that does not seem to meet these criteria. And this is exactly what I found studying the state-society relations among the Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic, something I've been doing for quite a few years for my PhD. So my Russian-speaking interlocutors in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were deprived of recognition to various degrees. Some were not citizens, many did not speak the official language, at least not fluently, which fed into the perception of them as potentially alien and threatening minorities whose loyalty to the national state was continuously called into question. And these fears kind of only increased with Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Of course, my interlocutors themselves did not feel as a threat to the state, and they used the fact that they are taxpayers, the fact that they pay taxes, to challenge this dominant narrative that depicted them as such. So I am proposing that their argument was grounded in this prevalent idea, as discussed at the beginning, about taxation as the core of citizenship and political membership, and the fiscal contract as the basis of their relationship with the state and other members of the community. So my Russian-speaking interlocutors used taxes to claim full membership in the political community as good, loyal, deserving state subjects equal to any other ethnically Lithuanian, Latvian, or Estonian citizen. Their focus on taxes also allowed them to try and reverse the dominant narrative by arguing that it was not them who were bad minority subjects, for example, because they did not speak the official language, which is the most important marker of the national identity and the key membership criteria in the Baltics, but the state that in their view failed to recognize and treat them as equal and contributing members of the national collective. So this is kind of what they wanted, and this is what they kind of felt that the state fell short on its side of the perceived social contract. That way, taxes and the idea of the fiscal contract as the basis for political membership allowed my Russian-speaking interlocutors to imagine a more inclusive, in their view, state-society relationship, which is undifferentiated along ethno-linguistic lines, but rather grounded in people's economical and fiscal contributions. So for them, the fiscal contract presented a more objective and neutral, maybe even easier way of entering into the relationship with the state, which is something that they desired. And yet, of course, the question remains, right? How successful were my interlocutors' attempts to join the Lithuanian, Latvian, or the Estonian national communities as taxpayers and as fiscal subjects more generally? So on one hand, the payment of taxes did allow them to become citizens, if not officially, many still are not, but at least to feel like a deserving part of the political community. On the other hand, them paying taxes did not change my Russian-speaking interlocutor's position in a substantial way. So any good state subject is expected to pay their taxes, but on its own, taxes is not enough to make one a fully fledged citizen, especially if other membership criteria is perceived as more important. And even more so, my interlocutor is arguing that their other deeds could compensate for their lack of the official knowledge, could and is often kind of taken as confirming the public fears about the Russian-speaking population, as mentioned before. So to bring it all together and to come back to the question, so is there such a thing as a fiscal or even a social contract? So I follow Gwen and Miranda, whom I mentioned before, in arguing that even if the social contract does not exist as an objective fact, and I think this is an interesting thing to play with, the idea, it still remains a powerful and a widespread idea. And as such, I argue that it can be an empowering one, especially for those who find themselves outside the perceived national body or the perceived kind of social contract. And there's quite a bit of other research that also shows how, for example, women, minorities, people working in the informal economy, or others who are disadvantaged in one way or another want to pay their taxes, precisely because of this perceived recognition, protection, or even voice that it is believed to grant them. So there exists fiscal and social contract. And yet, we as scholars should be aware of the limitations of the idea. And we should not take the existence of the fiscal, but also the social contract for granted, and maybe not just in non-Western contexts, but in our own Western societies as well. So I believe that the task is to critically inquire the concept of the fiscal and social contract itself, to ask where do these ideas come from and models, right, in general, but also in our particular contexts that we study, why they are so prevalent or not, right, kind of paying close attention to the context and the history of the place, as I think was suggested in the description of the event. And also what other alternative to the contractarian models are in operation. So what kind of relationships are happening there on the ground? And I believe that this could allow us to rethink how we organize our societies and maybe think maybe there can be some alternatives there. So thank you so much. I'll finish here, hopefully within my time.
Perfect, Maria, and perfect on time. So this was very interesting, and it raises a lot of interesting questions that I think we can come back to, particularly, which I want to pick up also in the Q&A, this about the relationship between minorities and minorities as taxpayers, and what does it mean to prove loyalty in a way? Is it enough to pay tax to prove your loyalty to the state or ruler regime? Probably not. But it could be one stepping stone to becoming something else. But before we get to that, Viljar, please.
Yeah. So I will present to you a small case study questioning the fiscal contract diverging data from Mali. And yeah, I'm going to try to show you a sort of a paradox or a puzzle that we had from our research in Mali, where we've, among other things, looked at the local tax system. And so Mali's been in conflict since 2012. They had a democracy from between the early 90s until 2020, when there was a military coup and the military took over again, with a back-to-back coup in 2021. Things had been on a downward trend towards then, and afterwards the military, as you may have seen in the media, they took up the fight with France, who they see as the neo-colonial power. France had to leave. MINUSMA, the UN contingent, was also forced out, and Russia has become the new security partner. But with the conflict, security-wise, things are still, security is still pervasive. Economic hardship has continued, and Mali now, together with Niger and Burkina Faso, are in this conflict with ECOWAS, much of the international environment, and are threatening to leave the organization. So this downward trend of state performance, or as you can see on typical measures of state performance, they seems to have continued under the military regime, and different conclusions are drawn from this picture, but mainly that there was a breakdown in the social contract leading to the military takeover in 2020. But further analysis that have come out later, for example by the World Bank, still see the social contract as either broken or breaking down amid rising violence. Citizens lose faith in the state's ability to protect them, provide justice, or deliver services. So the deliverables that Marcus was listing up, they seem to be failing on all of those. And just a small excerpt from our own field work in Bamako, Central Mali. Often talking to different types of taxpayers, people pay taxes, but they usually don't see any return. They don't know what their money is used for, and they usually just see politicians during elections. And now elections are out of the picture. So then you're left with what constitutes the basis for the authority of the current military junta. When you read this picture here, what I showed you from before, you would think that they rest on coercion. They rest on the power to use force to quell their political rivals. But if we look at other data sources, and contrary to our expectations that in perception surveys you would imagine that the regime is quite illegitimate. But if you look at different sources, Afrobarometer, Malimeter, as you see here, is from a German institute that do surveys biannually in Mali, done it since for over 10 years, and different Malian surveys. They all show the same trend, which is that here is people asked about how they evaluate the general situation of the country in the last year, whether it has improved, remained at the same level, or deteriorated. It's a very broad question. One can put so many things into it, but what's interesting is the trend. 2017, 2019, you see people perceive things to be worsening during the democratic regime, which eventually led to the protest. When you get to 2021 and the military is taking full control, things are improving, but a little bit like 2017. The interesting thing is 2024. Most people perceive things to be improving. And you find the same thing with Afrobarometer surveys. All across, even the perception of corruption is that things are improving. The president in particular is hugely popular in these surveys. Now, there are some insecurities with this data, since most of those people seems to be residing in urban areas. So what people think in the countryside can still be seen as a sort of a black box. But the picture you see here is a regime that rests on something more than just coercion, which our normal conceptualization of the social contract focused on public service delivery, protection, don't really catch. And this is where we come into what Marcus said about the narrative that brings in the social contract. Here's a picture of Assimi Goita. It's throughout these 4 years, if the regime wants people, especially in Bamako, in the capital, to rally for something, people come out. They seem to enjoy tremendous support. And this is the foreign minister of the current regime, Diop, and they have been very vocal, creating a narrative of a Mali taking matters into their own hands again, reclaiming the sovereignty of Mali. And so they use all of these cultural symbols, histories going back to the Malian Empire, using it in the present, and painting a picture of a Mali with many, many enemies that needs to be fought, and that both internal and external. The biggest internal is the old political elite that most people perceive to have delivered nothing during the 3 decades of democracy. So, and what can this divergence tell us about how we understand state-society relations? The fiscal contract, I'm oversimplifying here, see an explicit or implicit agreement between citizens and the government, and it's this tax for services exchange they usually look at. And you try to get this good cycle going, more taxes, higher government revenues, better services, greater trust in government, which gives a stronger social contract. But what we see in Mali is that when you take into account the symbolic resources that are employed, you see that narratives, cultural symbols matter. They can provide social meaning to the actions of state leaders. So instead of the government delivering something like this, they've been delivering a good narrative. And I guess in the start, people would think that you cannot eat sovereignty. So how long can this actually last? But it has lasted for 4 years now without there being big protests against the regime, which the regime has then been forced to crack down on. So this, we're trying to tease this out in different articles, how this works. And when I'm thinking about a social bond, it's just an attempt, a suggestion to how to think differently about, a little bit differently about the relationship between state and society, and that the narrative that's being created in Mali has some kind of complementarity and alignment with social imaginaries in Mali, that values, norms, belief in how you perceive the world and act upon it. The regime and parts of the population, especially in urban areas, are much more in sync now than they were under the democratic regime, which gives them support. So here you get more into where here you have very tangible things that are delivered. What we see in Mali is more that the intangible benefits of the regime currently in power is much more important. So whether we should think of a social bond, or we should expand on the social contract, or find ways to be more attentive to the symbolic resources, the shared narrative around the social contract, that's up for debate. But all in all, Mali is a very interesting case in this regard. And I can stop there.
Thank you so much, Viljar. And then I think I would like to invite you up to this small podium, or whatever we should call it, stage or whatnot. Thank you so much, Arne. I think this was extremely interesting, and it sort of comes together in different ways. And if we go back to this with if we think that this, you called it fiscal essentialism, I sort of like that. But if whatever we call it, if we say that there is more to this, then the question is, what is this more? If there may be a fiscal contract in some places, but there are also other types of contracts in one way or another that has that create some sort of social bond. So this means, at least to me, that we do not necessarily need to sort of throw out contract theory completely. But maybe we need to emphasize more on the fact that when we think about a contract, I think that almost any kind of contract we can imagine, there is a certain element of power and hierarchy in them. It's very hard to imagine a contract that sort of is based on complete equality. And if there is not complete equality, there is also somebody is more powerful than the other part in that contract, and then that more powerful part has some sort of coercive power, some sort of ability to force the other person to fulfill their part of the contract, whereas the more powerful one may also fulfill his or her or that part of the contract, but it do not necessarily have to. Or, as in the case of Mali, which I think is a fascinating case, and me and Viljar are also working on a joint paper on this, trying to explain this sort of paradox, that at least one should not underestimate, and here I would like to bring in your views, Marcus, based on your work in the Middle East and North Africa. The narrative power of some of these regimes, which has sort of, from the case of Morocco in the West and onwards, who has sort of been able to sort of how should I say, water down and carry on despite the fact that they every now and then has been met also with dramatic events, social protests and whatnot. I mean, I think that Morocco is an interesting case with, with so much legitimacy to the Moroccan state tied to the kingdom and the king. But also, I mean, quite remarkably, sort of how Algeria survived the whole hierarchy. I mean, it's basically back to business in Algeria as far as I can see. Egypt, the same thing. So, I mean, what's going on here? I mean, have we underestimated the ability of these regimes to sort of this type of regimes to really portray and put forward very powerful narratives, and not the least the fact that, as we talked about just before we entered in here, I mean, the case of, you can point towards certain neighbors and say, do you prefer me or do you want that one? So Marcus, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is very important. I think the whole concept of the social contract does not explain the result of what is the result of the social contract, so to say. At the beginning, we have different actors which have access to certain resources, be it natural resources, be it economic resources, be it power. Based on this access to certain resources, they have more or less bargaining power in what they can expect from the others and not. So the social contract, as I think, and I like the idea, it's not a written thing, it's a construct, but I think it's very deeply in people's minds, is something that we need to live together at all in a country. But the outcome is based on what the state has and can offer and what society has and can give. And why I think this is at the very beginning, I would argue the social contract is perhaps as old as humanity, or at least as old as people have settled. Yeah? I would always argue after the Neolithic Revolution, when people could for the first time accumulate wealth, increasingly we had some haves and some have less or have nots. And the one who have less, they might always be tempted to take away a bit from those who have, which these don't like, of course. So they cry for a state to organize the order in the village or where they live together. And the have-nots would argue, okay, if you pay the mayor and the policeman who keeps up the order, and in times of crisis share a little bit of your wealth, then we can have this order. And there you have the 3 Ps. We have the protection, which is mainly in the interest of the rich. We have the provision, which is mainly in the interest of the poor. And which we have the participation, which says we both speak about who gets how much of it. So I think for some people living together, we need some at least implicit order, and that's the social contract.
But it's played out very differently,
Yes.
in very different contexts. Yes. And this equation around both the level of asymmetry in it,
Absolutely.
but also what this means with regard to the element of force and coercion that is needed. And of course, the more insecure a regime feels, the more it needs to rely on coercion in order to keep this about, so to speak. But you talked about the haves and the have-nots, and that can also be translated, Maria, to sort of minority populations, but also have issues of majority and minority very dramatically can change. We have seen this in a number of countries in Africa and in the Middle East. I mean, during colonial times and then post-colonial times. I mean, in the case of Mali, we have the situation of the Tuareg, who used to be sort of the the custodians of not necessarily the desert, but sort of the Sahara belt, whose, of course, position was turned completely upside down, not necessarily by colonialism, but by the post-colonial state, when they suddenly went from being, a powerful group in the north to becoming almost forever doomed to be the minority ruled by the black majority, which previously had been people where they had taken slaves from. Some of the same thing could be said about what has happened in the Baltic countries with the Russian-speaking minority. I mean, they used to be part of the. It would be wrong to talk about the Soviet as the ruling population, but at least as a perhaps slightly privileged population in the Baltic state, which suddenly now are faced with a situation of being a minority, or in the case of Latvia, not necessarily a minority, but a group whose belonging to a certain extent to the new states, if not totally contested, at least is questioned. But you seem to suggest, Maria, that they try to sort of utilize their role as taxpayers as a way of showing that they are loyal citizens. We do pay, we stand up to our duties as citizens. So that's basically your argument. But how do they then feel when they feel that we are trying to do what every citizen should do? We pay our taxes, but do they feel that they feel, in a way, they seem to? Well, your argument is that they are trying to fulfill their part of the bargain, but do they feel that the state then fulfills its part of the bargain? And if not, what kind of new narratives do this leads to, both from the majority and the minority parts of the population?
Yes, so I think that kind of what I try to do in my work, and one of the things we are discussing, that there can exist multiple social contracts or multiple ideas how among different states, but within the state as well, different groups or individuals can have very different ideas, what kind of relationship with the state they want, and what defines citizenship, what defines a good, loyal member of the national community. And one of the arguments I am making, that a lot of my interlocutors kind of chose or to kind of focus on their taxpayer kind of subjectivity and them being taxpayers, because it was kind of one of the more available legitimate ways to make such claims. That's because I said the idea that taxes is, again, to quote Nicolette and Robin, whom I mentioned in my presentation, is perceived as a ritual of citizenship almost. So they are kind of referring to the ideas that are very prevalent. And kind of maybe because that is how they define their relationship to the state, kind of their imagined social contract. And they perceive that they do not receive as much recognition or appreciation, if maybe taxes is not enough to make them fully fledged citizens, then it might seem that the state is failing on its side of the social contract. And of course, there are many more things to that, more material ones, whether like healthcare and education and so on. But I think this is, as we spoke before, maybe to kind of bring in those kind of less material things that you might want from your relationship with the state, like to be acknowledged or to be seen, appreciated. And again, from whose perspective and how do you define that? But maybe one way to kind of expand our ideas on the fiscal contract and the social contract is also think about those less material kind of desires or expectations that you expect from your relationship with the state and other members of the community.
Mm. But I mean, I think it was mentioned both by Marcus and by you, Maria, but also by you, Viljar, with your quote from one of these market vendors. I mean, tax is in many ways, I mean, one of the sort of both primary, but also one of the sort of, I would also say, first encounters between a citizen and the state. I mean, I remember I was reflecting back, sort of thinking about when did I first pay my taxes? And I think it was sort of when I was 14, 15 years old, and I was, carrying the morning paper around at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's probably not, I've understood that that's probably not legal anymore for one to do that, but I don't think we did any harm by going with delivering the morning paper, actually. But that was the first time that I had to reflect upon the fact that I am a citizen, because I have to pay. And I'm not, before that, I mean, I was receiving, I was going to school, I was, these kind of things. But suddenly, I mean, I was earning money, so I had to pay. And it was sort of a little bit of a revelation, I think, sort of discovering that, I mean, citizens come with certain obligations. So it's something of the first to meet. And something that we discussed also before we started is this about, one tend to believe often, wrongly, that in weaker states and more fragile states, the state is less visible. It's completely wrong. I mean, the weaker and more fragile a state is, often the more visible in your face the state is. Because when I'm an old man, so it was back in the days when I had to pay started figuring out how to pay my taxes. I didn't sit with a tax collector. It wasn't a tax collector knocking at my door saying, Morten, we have heard that you started going with the newspaper, so you need to pay your taxes. It was still distant. But in the case of Mali, but also in the case of several of the MENA countries, this is not very distant. It's a very close-up relationship. And I was wondering, Viljar, if you could try to go a little deeper into this. Because in all the data that you have and we have on this from Mali, with their personal experiences with the tax collector, they don't like these people. They utterly hate them and would like to see them go away, because they very rightly point out that on the level of the communal, they don't receive much at all. They receive hardship, they receive, exhaustion, all these kinds of things, but very little, very few times that anybody in these interviews can point to say that I have paid my taxes, so now we have this well in the community. Most likely because it's impossible to prove, even if there is a well in the community, that was also paid for by their taxes. So, but still, I mean, you have this sort of, what kind of social morale is it then that sort of makes they detest the lowest level of this state, but they support the man at the top? If you could try to sort of elaborate a little bit on that. And then we see how it ties in with the two other presentations.
Yeah, I can try a little bit. As you say, our fieldwork shows that when people interact with the tax collectors, most at the local level, it's mostly, you are approached by the tax collector. For those who run businesses, if you don't, in Mali, if you don't pay, your shop is closed on the same day, cutting you off from all the income that you have. And also if you also take the case of Liberia, we see many of the same thing. But what's particular about Mali is that we have all these data at the local level showing that people are very, very dissatisfied. The point arises that I don't see anything from the taxes that I pay. But then we have this perception data that the regime is enjoying overwhelming support, at least from urban areas. So what's going on then? And it's what we've been toying then is that what's going on at the local level. It goes on in its own bubble, sort of say, in its own reality. That is not connected to what's going on between the supporters and the regime. That is a different thing. And what in practice that means is that the president in the regime, the junta, with the president Assimi Goïta, the former colonel, is this strongman figure now. That's sort of this exceptional man in an age of exception in Mali, there to take back sovereignty. And the way he does this is that he is separated from the old state in Mali, run by the by the dirty politics of the democratic regime fall. So he is sort of separated from this. It's a little bit what we see, for example, with Vladimir Putin in Russia, that it's a state with a very strong coercive apparatus compared to Mali. But there's also Vladimir Putin is also somewhat separate from the state and the corrupt bureaucracy and what the state does. So people can blame the bureaucracy, blame the local authorities, but the guy at the top, he's trying to fix all this. It's not his fault. He's trying to fix all the old wrongs, and so which means that when, for example, we do feel well at that at a local level, we ask about taxes, public services, we get the sense that people are very, very dissatisfied. And normally we would tie this up to the regime or the government and say that, okay, people are really dissatisfied here, that must harm the legitimacy of the regime. But that's not the case here, because this is somehow two separate things. That's how it seems to be working now. But at other times, other points in time, in other spaces, this can be connected. And if you go other places in the world, then, for example, also in Liberia, people don't see anything in return for the taxes, and they tie it to the government. Yeah, so that's a different case. Yeah.
Thank you. But I mean, would you say that is it possible to say something similar about, for example, the Sisi regime in Egypt? That he, in a way, I mean, this also goes. You mentioned Putin, but this also goes, I think, deeper into Russian history about this idea about the father in Moscow who was never him to blame. It was bad advisors and corrupt advisors. And if only the father had known, he would have redeemed this or put it right. So, but I don't know. But I mean, is there something similar going on in some of these authoritarian states in the Middle East?
Definitely. And I think it's a strategy of all these regimes to decouple the top of the regime from the administration. Yeah? In the monarchies of the region, Morocco, Jordan, this is easy. The king is above all. He appoints the government. And if something is going wrong, it's the government to blame, and they just exchange the government. So that's easy. A little bit, this is even true for the republics in the region. Yeah? So the president itself tries to decouple itself from the bad things. Yeah, and I mean, I mean, the same happened. I mean, all over the world. I know from my friends and relatives who've been living in Germany, in Eastern Germany, very often. Yeah, if something was going wrong, if Honecker knew what is going on, yeah, he would change the game. Yeah, and I think this is a normal reaction. People like to have a good guy at the top, yeah, but also the guy at the top tries to sterilize itself from the rest. Yeah. In addition to this, however, I would, because you mentioned the Sisi regime, this is a particular case also. Here, I think what is very interesting is to see the narrative that this regime has. We know we fail in many aspects. We are aware of this. But think about the alternatives. Yeah? Look at neighboring Libya. Look at neighboring Syria. So we don't give you participation since long. We give you ever less provision, but at least we give you protection. So look at Libya, where you have not even protection anymore. Yeah? So here again, the narrative comes in, but also that people compare themselves sometimes just with the situation before. And I would say perhaps in Mali, they are just happy about small improvements, and don't compare themselves with Europe or with any country in Africa, but just with what they have before. And in Egypt, they are satisfied to be better off than just in Libya.
Could be the case. But finally, Maria, I mean, how would this sort of, these narratives, both narratives from the state, but I would also imagine that in the case of the Russian-speaking minority, they also produce their narratives about the state. I mean, you mentioned this sort of, which I would call a narrative in itself. I mean, this about we as dutiful citizens who pay our taxes. But I mean, if this sort of, they think they fulfill their duty, but if they feel that this is not met by the other side, what kind of narratives do that lead to? Have you looked into that part of the picture?
I thank you so much for the question. I think what I try to do is compare those two ideas of the social contract, one that was thought that is there or not there, and the one that is desired. First of all, listening to the conversation before, I also had that image about the old king at the top who only knew what was happening on the ground. He would stop that. And it made me think also kind of about I don't know how it is in your case, as kind of in my case, the idea of the social and fiscal contract emerged as something apolitical, something that has nothing to do with politics, which as everywhere is perceived as this kind of dirty thing, whether at the top or maybe on the local level with tax inspectors who do not necessarily treat you as you want them to. And then kind of this relationship built on taxes or in general on some kind of idea of a contract kind of allows you to step away from that and create some kind of relationship that is, as I said, more neutral or more objective. That's why kind of I found it was quite an appealing idea to kind of as a way to move away from politics in general. But when it comes to narratives, I think that one of the strongest ones in my field was, and again that wasn't only kind of among my Russian-speaking interlocutors, but all the kind of residents of the towns I worked on once was kind of this idea of a normal life, of a comfortable life, again dignified life, right? How do we imagine what that implies, and what do you think we deserve? I don't know, starting from what can we afford in a shop and what kind of holiday we afford ourselves to kind of those more kind of less tangible things like respect, right? So kind of at least from and I've worked with kind of narratives in society among the people. I would say that was kind of the desire, was that kind of normal, dignified, comfortable life as so those kind of.
And isn't that really what everybody searches
Yeah.
for, a comfortable life after all? Okay, thanks so much. I would like to sort of, we have some time left, so I'll see if there is any questions from the audience around this. Hopefully we have been able to provoke some. Yes, please. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. This obviously shines a light on the elephant in the room, which are immigrants, documented and undocumented, many of whom work, pay their taxes, but are not afforded many rights very often, and their legitimacy are questioned, and they don't seem to have, in many places, in the United States where I live certainly, a problem with legitimacy. So I wanted to ask you, how about this wave of immigration that we're seeing now, many of whom are political, economic, fleeing because of insecurity? How do we deal with this big ball of people who certainly deserve to be a part of the contract, certainly if they pay taxes, but they're not?
Is there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Andreas, Tax Justice Norway. Just a quick question for Marcus, I guess. You mentioned protest comes mainly from privileged people, less than you would think. The more privileged, the more protests come from up there. Does that make the protests more less valid, less relevant? Does it have any impact, do you think? Yeah.
No, I think we can take those. Do you want to start, Marcus? Because it was
Yeah.
a direct question for you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. No, not of course, not less valid, but it tells us it's important to take this into consideration, just to know that there may be much more under the surface, yeah, and under the surface, dissatisfaction may be directed to completely different issues. Yeah. So very often we see, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, this dissatisfaction explodes only if things are getting very, very serious. Then you have these bread riots for a day, for 2 or 3, but because people with less income, with less education, tend to be less organized, so the protests are quick and then they break together again. So it's the middle class, typically, that is able to uphold protests for a longer time, but doesn't show what is really going on below. If I might add also quickly to this question, it's a very, very interesting question, and I'm far from having a real answer to you. Just one little thing is, in this last special issue, we had a colleague of ours at our institute who is of Syrian Kurdish origin, has written an article about the integration of Syrian Kurds who have gone to Iraq and established businesses there. And the very fact of formalizing these businesses and then paying taxes, yeah, in their own perceptions, has made themselves become much more a part of the Iraqi social contract. Yeah? So they felt like being excluded from the Iraqi social contract unless they interacted with the Iraqi government, or with the administration, by paying taxes, by formalizing their business. Yeah?
I think that also, if I may, before I turn to you, to that question. It depends on a number of things. How this is sorted out. It depends on government policies, government regulations, but it also depends very much on the temporality of the situation, I would say. And where this is happening. You see, for example, that a number of African countries where we work, there is they have showed on at least in the short to medium term horizon an enormous absorption capacity when it comes to refugees and migrants. Enormous. But it also shows that nothing lasts forever, and how this is organized both on a community level but also on a state level. There is so much variation to it that it's almost impossible to point to a universal trend concerning how this is how this affects both the relationship between the state and newcomers, but also how it affects the relationship between newcomers and, how should I say, for lack of a better word, the previous population. And again, it's something that it leads. What we know from history about large movements of people is that it basically tends to lead to 3 things. It leads to disruption. It leads to social, but it also leads to social, technical, and political innovation, and it may also lead to new states. This is sort of in general what we know about this. How this will play out in the current context, that is almost impossible to say. But that every state that is affected by large movements of people needs to find a way of dealing with it that sort of balances between the rights of people legitimately seeking protection with sort of being able to keep some sort of social stability without, because if not, I mean, you will need, that will lead to counter narratives that we know, and we've seen also that right now, we know from the past, but we also see that right now, that can be utilized by certain political entrepreneurs for different political projects. And it is a difficult balance for states, at least states that tries to uphold, how should one say, at least some parts of humanitarian principles and humanitarian law. It's not easy, but a lot of states could also probably do better, at least in the narratives they present about this. Because some, at least as I see it, some of these narratives that being presented by some states, they are hopelessly naive. Other states try to avoid going into this at all because it's seen as unpleasant. But what we do know, both from here, from the contemporary and the history, is trying to avoid these issues will at least most certainly lead to the most destructive results. That would be my take on it. But maybe, Viljar, you would like to address some of this also, because Mali and the Sahel and also Liberia in the past saw massive displacement, but also waves of refugees. Right now, I mean, Mali is more producing refugees than it's harboring. But I mean, this has sort of waxed and waned in these territories, and people have, and the Sahel is a place where people are on the move, which also creates its own tensions with regard to taxation when people constantly are on the move.
Yeah.
Farmer and herders, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how much I have to say about this, but yeah, states traditionally prefer people who are settled in one place, people who are not moving, because they're easier to tax. So that's the part of the farmer-herder issue that's seen throughout the Sahel. Now with the conflicts, all the big conflict area together with Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, which created huge displacement, especially internal displacement of people. Mali is that, well, yeah, of course, many are cut off from the normal income sources. Local authorities in the areas where people are fleeing from, their revenues dry up mostly. They completely depend on the central state. So, for example, we had an interview with a mayor from central Mali, and he would speak that from the conflict erupted in his area from 2015, they had not been collecting a dime of 1 franc of taxes. They completely relied on whatever revenue streams came from the central government. And that also means that for those who are left in conflict affected areas, there's neither protection or provision or any participation. And perhaps also...
But this also affects communes in Bamako, who's now suddenly seeing... Bamako is one of the fastest growing cities in the world.
Yeah, I think it's actually the 3rd fastest growing city in the world, which is immense. And when I've been there several times during fieldwork, locals, our colleagues also will talk about that. There's so much more people. People will talk about the problems in their own neighborhoods. There's all these sorts of things like cleaning up the streets, digging ditches for when the rainy season come, that they're not just able to do. So people are left to do with community self-help, and you have those who have emigrated to, for example, to the global north. There's a lot of remittances, and people who had access to those kind of resources. We saw some few cases of it. They were the ones that were funding digging of ditches, wells, and these kinds of things that people would want to have from the local authorities and see their tax money get into this. But the whole situation with the conflict makes it incredibly difficult. And it also speaks to the problems that the junta, while from our perspective, we prefer a more democratic regime, but they they face the same problems as the democratic regimes with that they even if they wanted to provide more, their resources are very scarce and there's so much to do, and so it's quite it almost seems like it's more natural that they have gone in this solidifying this narrative direction for a social contract or social bond. Yeah.
Thank you. Maria, any final words?
Yes, so to kind of go back again to the first question, I think what I do, what I mentioned in this presentation, but also what I try to do in this article that hopefully will come out sooner or later, is to kind of complicate this relationship between taxation and citizenship, because it is often, as we speak today, kind of taxation is thought of as the social contract. And even today, I don't know whether we have done this or not, but the terms citizen and taxpayer are often used interchangeably, almost as synonyms. So it is kind of almost presumed that if you pay taxes, you are a member, right? And yet this isn't the case quite often, and so kind of obviously there must be then something else, right, that makes you a member, because it seems even though in kind of our even everyday speech we treat taxation as again this kind of thing that should kind of open the door to political membership, it doesn't necessarily, right? So then I think it's a kind of productive way to try and understand, okay, so what is actually happening there? What does make you a member, or grant you kind of this access into political community or the society more broadly, in addition to taxes, and why this is still such a kind of prevalent thing, right? Why do we still say taxpayer when we mean citizen, or the other way around? So that's kind of very briefly to try and respond.
Thank you. Yes, we can do one more question.
I think you have got a very, very interesting project, and a very difficult one. Because for me, it sounds like the squaring of the circle. When I listen to the different stories from Mali, from your area, Middle East and North Africa, and from your area, the structures are so different. In my understanding, I must say that I'm not a social anthropologist or something, I'm an engineer and economist. But in most of these countries, I think it's a problem to find something which I could define as some kind of a contract, because things are moving in so many different directions. Whereas when we come to your case with the previous Russian states, there we have got a feeling that you have got states which are functioning, but you've got a big minority inside. But we also know that kind of tension might be underneath that. And that, I think, was what we saw in Donbass. In Donbass, they were paying taxes to Ukraine. But what blew up the thing, or what I understand, is that suddenly it was the cultural, social challenges which blew up in addition to various economic interests. So where do you think you will land?
Yeah.
That's a very good question, where all of this will end, and I don't think we have an answer to that. But I mean, at least speaking as my attempt to sort of share this panel and try to bring them together, and quite deliberately we wanted to have quite diverse cases, because I think it's, yes, I mean, contextually there are huge differences, but people who work on these different cases, one grapples with some of the very sort of same very basic academic issues concerning how is state authority established, how does it come about, how is it maintained over time, what kind of bonds do a state need to create to various social groups, and how do various social groups respond to the fact that they are being ruled by someone. And Yes, and since we are now here talking about states who either are modern states, like the states in the Baltic countries, states in the Middle East and North Africa region that were somewhere in between. They are, in effect, modern states. I mean, some of them are relatively strong also with regard, at least with their coercive apparatuses. And then we have the case of Mali, who is, you know, normally is a modern state, and it has all the sort of, if you paint a diagram of the Malian state, it would look more or less like these other states that we are talking about. It is just that it lacks fundamentally in certain capacities. But still, I mean, some of the basic issues and questions are the same. This about establishing authority, maintaining authority, trying to create some sort of social order. This is something that people and groups of people and authority groups and then finally states has grappled with ever since. And I think we need to also here in Norway need to take into consideration the fact that the state is always in the making. The state is never completely made. It's a dynamic entity that always has been changing and will continue to change. So what this leads to, particularly in the kind of context that we're talking about now, with new sort of dramatic geopolitical contestations, war in Europe, which has its dramatic effect on Europe, but also has its consequences elsewhere. I mean, from the tax riots in Nairobi to what is currently happening in the Sahel. I mean, everything is linked together in one way or another. So I think it was useful to bring these things together. Are they very diverse, these conversations? Yes, but I also think that having these kind of facts-based, research-based conversations across different both geographical areas and respective fields. I mean, anthropology, the discipline of economy. I at least started out in political science. I don't really know what I am anymore. And Viljar is at least trying to get a PhD in political science. I think it's useful. So that would be my final words. But very quickly, Marcus, Maria, Viljar, your final, any final sentence you want to drop?
If you would like to start.
Since we are the host.
I can just go to the last question. The structures vary a lot, but we're all dealing with different nation states, and then there's also always the conflicts between who's part of this nation, who is to be the citizens, and take Mali, the case I am. Of course, you have different groups, the states supported by some groups who are in open conflict with different groups who vehemently disagree about what kind of nation and what kind of state Mali is going to be, and that's, as Morten says, states are in the making. They're probably going to be continued conflict and arguing about this for a long time. And I also work in Liberia. Further there, it's also from that very imperial presidency, centralized states, that everything erupted with the military coup in 1980, civil war in 1990. And since then, Liberia has been trying to figure out what kind of state and nation it's going to be, and it's still an ongoing project. But I can end there.
Very briefly, I just probably want to thank the hosts again for organizing this, because I think we all come from different disciplines and different regions, and as Viljar said, at the end of the day, some of the big questions we're asking are actually quite similar or the same, and it's actually kind of bringing us all together in one room, makes us, but also kind of different disciplines talk among each other as well, because we so often close ourselves and do not know what is happening in other fields, when actually there are quite many shared themes and value, I think, in bringing together those very different cases that I think kind of then appears have quite a bit in common, at least in the bigger, when it comes to bigger themes. So very briefly, just thank you.
I would like to thank also, I think it's important to exchange these different views. it's important to discuss these concepts, to see what is in them, to what degree these concepts help us, and where is also the limits of these concepts. Yeah, we have to also acknowledge there is certain limits where other concepts may be powerful in explaining. And I think conversations like this one are very helpful and important to see the potential and the limits of these concepts.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience who has been with us, thanks to those who has been online, thanks to Arne and the communication department who always steers this so wonderfully. And I would just before we end, I will just say that thank you to our partners in the network, both Tax Justice Network Norway, CMI in Bergen, but also to our partners in various African countries. And we will organize a larger event in Oslo either in May or August next year, where of course both Maria and Marcus are duly invited right now. And we would also like to see if we can bring in some more people from the anthropology of tax network. So stay tuned for that one. And in the meantime, have a good afternoon. Perhaps it has stopped raining outside. You never know. Thank you.
Thank you.